the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kohatkar. It's Tuesday, November 4th, 2014, and it's also Election Day. We'll spend the hour exploring what's at stake with my guests David Dayan and Jody Armour. If the Republicans win the Senate, as it appears they will, what issues will they take aim at? What does it mean for President Obama's last 2 years in office? What impact could the Latino and Black vote have? How are women and young people voting? Plus, we'll hear a commentary from award-winning journalist Mumia Abu-Jamal. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is our news analyst, Robert Jensen. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Bob.
Hello, Sonali.
Well, U.S. drones have reportedly struck parts of Yemen this week, killing 10 people suspected of being members of al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has been operating with full force in Yemen and has also been fighting a Shia rebel group known as the Houthis, who took over the Yemeni capital of Sana'a in late September. The Houthis filled a power vacuum created by a seemingly paralyzed central government. At the same time as the U.S. drone strikes took place, clashes on the ground resulted in at least 10 more people being killed. Yemen is suffering from severe poverty and what is now being increasingly viewed as all-out civil war. It lies just to the south of the oil-rich U.S. ally Saudi Arabia. Now, Bob, of course, the U.S. never acknowledges that it has dropped bombs via drones, so we can only go on media reports. Is it ironic that on Election Day in the U.S. drone strikes aren't even an issue?
Well, of course, irony abounds in the United States on Election Day. All of the issues that should be on the agenda, from climate change to drone strikes, which typically aren't. I think this story reminds us of really three crucial questions around drones. One is about tactics. That is, is the tactic of using drone strikes, which of course doesn't have to involve U.S. troops on the ground, really working? And the answer is generally no. Even in the short term, it rarely achieves objectives. Second, the strategy. We tend to treat these questions as isolated incidents in countries. We go in, we try and fix what we see as a problem, and it rarely does. And that's part of the problem. The overall philosophy of the United States doesn't approach these as regional issues, which, as you point out, require a resolution of issues around the distribution of wealth and power, which the United States is generally opposed to a more democratic version.
And then U.S. mobile phone companies have found another ingenious way to tap into private user data in order to reap profits. The Electronic Frontier Foundation has found that Verizon and AT&T are using so-called super cookies to track sites that users browse while on their phones in order to sell targeted advertising. EFF has brought the practice to the notice of the Federal Communications Commission, a first step in what could turn into a legal battle. Verizon's tracking program is apparently further along than AT&T's. The practice mirrors what companies do to track users who browse the internet on their computers. The Washington Post reported that, quote, critics also say the super cookies, especially if more widely deployed, will be extremely valuable to intelligence agencies that monitor internet behavior. Bob, how dangerous is the confluence of commercial and government surveillance online?
Well, I think the answer is it's far more dangerous than we could probably even imagine. We don't trust concentrations of power in the government. That's appropriate. We don't trust concentrations of power in the economy and corporate hands, and that's appropriate. So when you marry these two concentrations of power, you have the possibility of incredible abuses. Of course, the abuses, in a sense, are already going on. The way that we're monitored to target advertising to us, the way that corporations kind of get inside our heads. But probably more dramatically, the threat is that with this technology available, whether it's in private or public hands, it's open to an even deeper abuse by government. And the reporting that came out of the Edward Snowden revelation tells us that this has already happened, that corporations have collaborated with the government to make this possible. This is a dramatically dangerous track we're on, and nothing seems to really stop it these days, even with these public revelations.
And finally, Shirley Sherrod, the embattled USDA official who was forced to resign amid a controversy several years ago, was apparently thrown under the bus by the White House. In 2010, the conservative website Breitbart News played an edited version of a speech Sherrod gave accusing her of making racist statements. Sherrod, who is African American, was asked to step down from her position, and Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack took lone responsibility for the decision, which became even more controversial after it emerged that Sherrod's remarks had been heavily manipulated through careful video editing. Emails have now emerged that reveal the White House was involved involved in the decision to force her resignation. Bob, I feel that the most important takeaway from the story is that the Obama administration has time and again capitulated to white conservatives and accepted this bizarre narrative that people of color are the ones who are racist and whites are the victims. What do you think?
Well, this is a horrifying story, and every detail we learn about it is more horrifying. Let's remember, first of all, that this strategy that you're articulating, the Democrats sort of moving to the right to appease conservatives, that started with the Clinton administration. Bill Clinton had his famous moment with the black female performer Sister Souljah, where he attacked her. So Obama, in some ways, is just following the Clinton playbook, which is kind of ironic. But this does remind us how quick white America is to, instead of honestly engaging with a history and contemporary practice of white supremacy, how quick white America is to turn it around. And as you say, this so-called charge of reverse racism. For an African-American president to participate in this is particularly grating. But this is a long time so-called New Democrat playbook, and it's disgusting no matter who's in the White House.
And Shirley Sherrod was offered her job back and an apology, but she declined. Bob Jensen, always a pleasure to have you on. I want to thank you so much for joining us. We'll talk to you next week.
Thanks, Sonali.
Robert Jensen is our daily Newsflash guest expert. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. When we come back, election coverage. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Americans are casting votes today in midterm elections, which traditionally have low turnout, but which could signify the direction of the nation's future. Polls suggest Republicans are poised to take control of the Senate, albeit with a smaller margin than in the last election. The current balance of 55 to 45 in favor of Democrats may flip to 50 to 47, with two possible runoffs and one independent who may or may not caucus with the Democrats. Although there are not that many polls conducted on House races, the few that have been done suggest the GOP could take as many as between 5 and 15 seats over their current majority. Now, what does such a scenario mean, not just for President Obama's remaining term, but for legislation and congressional decision-making? My guest is David Dayen. He is a contributing writer at Salon, and he now joins me in studio. Welcome to Uprising, David.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us. So let's begin by talking about the polls. It's very easy to devolve these conversations around elections into a sort of horse race discussion, so I want to be mindful of that. But how confident are you that the Republicans will indeed get either a majority in the Senate or just at least 50 seats?
It looks pretty good for the Republicans. Nowadays, we have these people who aggregate all the polls that are taken in a particular state and put them together, add some special sauce, and people like Nate Silver and things like that. And their predictions show with a confidence of about 60 to 70% that Republicans will take the Senate, and as many as flipping as many as 8 seats to have 53 seats eventually in their majority, or maybe even more.
And this interesting question about the Kansas independent, and the fact that there are at least 2 states where there could be possible runoffs because the races are so close means we may not know the Senate makeup until possibly January, and even then it might be in the hands of the one independent senator from Kansas if he wins.
Yeah, I would say it's unlikely we do know who who will take the Senate tonight, just because, Alaska, it usually takes weeks for that vote to get actually counted. Last time when Mark Begich, who is the Democrat in Alaska, ran and won, it wasn't until 8 days into the election that he actually took the lead. So we probably won't know that. And as you said, Georgia and Louisiana are likely to have runoffs that could go in Georgia. They go in January. So it's going to be some time before we know exactly how all this shakes out.
Let's take a look at one Senate race in particular, and that's State Senator Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, a very long-time veteran senator. If he wins his re-election, which isn't necessarily guaranteed, he's poised to be named the new Senate Majority Leader if the Republicans then win their majority. If he survives his re-election, what sort of leadership could we see from him?
Well, it will be interesting to see because McConnell's career to this point as minority leader has been on simply obstructing whatever comes out of the Senate. So what he will do when he's in a governing position is kind of an open question. How far will he push it? Will he use the budget process to force changes in policy? Will he, will he try to be more conciliatory and maybe pass immigration legislation or things like that? I think that's unlikely. I think there's going to be a lot more gridlock in Congress. But there are some discrete issues where I think there will be some progress made, and I don't know if I would call it progress from my perspective, but there will be some legislation that I think the White House and Republicans in Congress will get together on.
Wow. Okay. So an alliance between President Obama and a Republican-controlled Congress. What could those issues be? Maybe not progress, maybe regress. Is that what we should be calling them?
Exactly. I think the first thing would be corporate written trade deals. The president has sought things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I'm sure your viewers know about, and another large trade deal in Europe. Right now, Harry Reid has not put up for a vote fast-track authority to allow the president to negotiate trade deals and then bring them back for ratification without any amendment possibilities. I think Republicans will do that, and they will give him fast-track authority and support him if he is able to negotiate these trade deals with Asia and Europe. So that's one, I think, area that's definitely going to happen. Another one could be things like the repeal of the medical device tax, which is a very controversial subject within Congress. Even vast majorities of Democrats actually support repealing that. It's a piece of Obamacare that is being one of the ways that is funding the legislation. So I think that's another issue that you could see done. And then there's things like energy policy. Perhaps the Keystone XL pipeline would get passed and maybe with enough of a majority that Obama wouldn't be able to veto it. Certainly in 2016, the solar installation tax credit actually expires. And I think that Republicans would be disinclined to extend that. And then on privacy and surveillance issues, I think that establishment Republicans, maybe not the libertarian Ron Paul types, but establishment Republicans and the White House are basically simpatico on keeping the status quo on surveillance and privacy issues.
So what you're articulating here may be at the heart of why Democrats tend to, and have tended to in the last few years, do poorly at the polls. I mean, of course, there's issues like districting, voter ID, but there's also issues. And if we have a Democratic president who's at odds with some factions of his own party and finds greater similarity and common ground with the Republican Party at large, what does that say about Democratic leadership and the differences between them and rank-and-file Democrats, who might be more reflective of the base?
Yeah, I think the biggest issue in this election is how Democrats respond to it. I mean, they're going to lose seats in Congress. Are they going to take the lesson that our problem was we were too liberal, or we thought of government as too much of a force in people's lives, or we thought that government should be expanded too much, and then we're going to pull back? That is the key question, I think, for the response, and that will set the trajectory of where the Democratic Party goes in 2016 and beyond. So it's pretty critical to see how that's done, and it's not necessarily the case that an overabundance of liberalism somehow will force will be the reason for this election going poorly for Democrats.
If anything, it could be, and it's likely, the opposite, right?
Yeah, I mean, Democrats really didn't stand for anything in this election. There wasn't really anything on the ballot that they said they would do if they were elected to Congress. So you look at a place like Kansas, where you have this sort of right-wing experiment going on with tax policy, tax cuts, austerity, and the public is actually rebelling against it. There's a possibility, not just the Senate race that you mentioned, but the governor to get overthrown in Kansas, a very red state. So that's an example of where, if you look at what policies are on the ballot, it could be that we show, at least in Kansas, that conservative policies are being rejected at the ballot box. And yet, Democrats tend nationally to take lessons from national elections that they need to move further to the middle.
Right, or to the right.
Or to the right.
Now, Fox News, which has quite gleefully decided that the election is already over, has projected some other future scenarios that don't involve collaboration between the president and a Senate majority. For example, quote, being able to pressure the administration with investigations and hearings from both chambers to hold up Obama nominees to key appointments even more. I mean, they've essentially been doing this now with a House majority, right. And that's going to be on steroids with a Republican control of both chambers?
Yeah, I think hearings is one of the major ways that Congress legislates, especially these days when they don't seem to do much passage of legislation. And so who controls things like the Senate Banking Committee or the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations really does matter. So I think you will see more investigations and also letting go of things like maybe bank malfeasance, and they won't throw a hearing to talk about that. As far as nominations are concerned, that's usually the province of the Senate, and I think certainly judicial nominations aren't likely to get through in the last 2 years under a Republican Senate, and most executive appointments, and that includes all sorts of appointments, including the Attorney General, who Eric Holder has announced that he's stepping down. But unless in the lame duck session an Attorney General replacement is selected, I think it's going to be very difficult to get a replacement for Eric Holder.
Right, and the current House majority, Republican majority in the House could stymie that in the last 2 months of this year as well. So what do you make of House races? The House is not getting nearly as much attention as the Senate, but polls are predicting that the GOP will not only retain their majority, but grow it. 538.com did an analysis and found that the Republicans could add as many as 7 seats to their current count of 233. Why is the GOP doing so well, and what could they do with those additional seats? I mean, is it simply just strengthen their current position, or it's overall not really going to make much difference in the House?
It will strengthen their majority, and actually it will put it at levels that was above any point in the so-called Gingrich Revolution from 1994 to 2006. I think that the general political environment, people are sort of feeling uneasy, whether it's economically in terms of stagnant wages and soaring inequality, or in terms of foreign policy, and that has been reflected in kind of a throw the bums out kind of election. But I think that the key factor here is that these races don't get a whole lot of attention, and that opens an opportunity for a lot of dark money to pour into these kinds of races. So you might see some things that are surprising liberal seats, places with high Democratic concentration where a Republican wins, and money could be the reason why.
And just briefly on the issue of money, which we've been covering on our program quite a bit, the Democrats seem to have essentially capitulated to the Citizens United decision and said, all right, we're going to join the game. Senate Majority PAC, which is their largest single outside money group, has flooded this year's elections with cash. And that sort of is disheartening because it essentially sends the message to voters that they're just going to join in the game.
It has become sort of an arms race between both parties. I believe this is the first year in memory that outside money will actually surpass the amount of money spent by the campaigns themselves. And so, who is really controlling our elections? Who is making the decisions? It's shadowy groups, often undisclosed money. That is making this big difference. And a lot of money, New York Times had an article about how a lot of money has come in late so that it doesn't have to be disclosed, or it will get disclosed after Election Day when it doesn't really matter.
Let's go back to the kinds of legislation we might be seeing under this Republican-controlled Congress if it does indeed emerge after today. What sort of proactive things do you expect from Republicans? And essentially, are we going to see the Republicans throw these reactionary measures at President Obama, who will basically veto them, and then they might attempt to override his veto?
Yeah, I mean, one thing to understand is that we still have a filibuster available in the Senate.
Which Democrats don't like to use, though, right?
Well, it'll be an interesting test because the last time the Senate really flipped, Republicans became implacable and started filibustering everything in sight. So will Harry Reid react to that by engaging in an advanced amount of filibusters of his own? I think on things like, this could be very much like the 2007-2008 Congress, where Mitch McConnell was sort of the last bulwark so that President George W. Bush didn't have to veto a lot of things. You could see a similar thing here where Harry Reid sort of takes the bullet on this stuff and protects President Obama, who doesn't have to filibuster a lot of things. I think on things like Obamacare and energy policy, you may see a decent amount of filibustering happening from the Senate. They wouldn't have to have every member engage in that. You would probably see some of the centrist members of the Democratic caucus vote with the Republicans, but as long as they could hold 50 votes, they would not be able to forward legislation through.
Okay, so in addition to congressional elections, there are lots and lots of other smaller races, many of which are really important. Slightly lesser than the congressional elections are gubernatorial elections. A majority of states are seeing gubernatorial elections, 36, I believe, out of 50, and that's huge. So what's on the horizon? How many flips are we going to see between Republicans and Democrats? And how does a party breakdown of governors really impact both national policy and, of course, statewide policy?
Yeah, I think it's very important. The gubernatorial races, you mentioned that 36 are up to grabs. As many as 12 are within the margin of error right now. And we could see changes, partisan changes, in states as blue as Massachusetts and Connecticut, and states as red as Kansas and Alaska. So it's really kind of interesting what's going on out there. And then there are states like Wisconsin and Michigan, which and Florida, which brought in very, very conservative governors in 2010, and we'll see if they have a backlash at the polls from the public in 2014. These matter a whole lot. I mean, the way in which people interface with government largely happens at the state level, whether it's higher education or Medicaid, which is a federal-state partnership, or transportation policy, or prisons, or all sorts of things that happen at the state level. And so the partisan breakdown there really does make a difference as to how people, experience their lives and interface with government.
Right. I mean, we've got things like immigration policy, which some conservative-led states have decided to do on their own in the absence of federal policy, much to the detriment of immigrant communities. We've seen the same sort of reactionary types of legislation with respect to women's reproductive rights. But then there's also the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. Also at stake at the state level, again, in the absence of federal policy or really good federal policy, is things like action on climate change. Here in California, we've seen a lot of that take place, putting this state where this program is produced ahead of other states. And so gubernatorial elections are pretty serious. There's also state legislative elections, which governors can't rely on. Governors rely on their state legislators to craft policy. But most Americans don't even know who their state legislative representatives are. Yeah,
it's really shocking, and there are a number of state legislatures which could flip, particularly from Republicans or Democrats to Republicans this year, particularly in Iowa, Arkansas, where those states would then have total unified one-party control of government, and you would start to see the types of things in Iowa and Arkansas that you saw in places like Wisconsin, where they had the massive labor uprising after checks on public employee unions, or places like Indiana or Michigan, which also had some anti-labor legislation pass in the last couple of years. So it matters a whole lot, and they are very lightly covered, and they usually kind of track where the national mood is, even though that doesn't necessarily follow, because the issues in states are far different than the issues in the nation at large.
The other aspect of our ballot that can get even more confusing than anything is the issue of judicial races. Not all states require voters to pick through the ballot judges, appeals court judges, or then affirm or basically allow them to continue or not their appointed seats. The most challenging part of my ballot are judicial races. There's a lot of information out there on like ballot propositions, even on legislative representatives, certainly on governors, congressional representatives, but it's hard to find information on judicial candidates. If you're a progressive, for example, and you want to figure out whether to vote for a judicial appointee or not, to vote to allow them to keep their term, or to vote for a runoff between two, you want to maybe go and find out what their policies are, whether they're pro-corporate, whether they might be good on, the tough on crime issues, whether they're into greater incarceration or not. But there's very little information out there. How do people make decisions on these races?
It's very difficult. There are some websites out there, as you mentioned, but the real problem is that these elections for judges are inevitably funded by people who end up having business before the court. It's absolutely crazy that the people most inclined to fund a judicial election are people with the biggest stake in who gets seated as a judge. And that's probably something we need to take a look at in America, that we run these judicial races like they're congressional elections, and we turn our judges, who are supposed to be impartial people who sort through the law and make decisions on an objective basis, well, when we turn them into candidates, that inevitably changes their role in a fundamental way, and I think that's a real problem for our democracy.
Right. I mean, one of the ways in which we might be able to determine how a judge might rule is who appointed them, a Democrat or a Republican. But even then, technically, a judge is supposed to be nonpartisan, supposed to interpret the law. I mean, we know that doesn't happen all the time. We know that there's plenty of so-called activist judges out there one way or another. So, yeah.
Right, but I mean, it's certainly not going to happen if you have Chevron funding a judge to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars. I mean, certainly you're not going to get impartiality that way. So whether or not those are partisan seats, the fact that they are elected rather than appointed is kind of disturbing to my view. Although there's, I guess, the other viewpoint that giving the public a check on a judge who may have presented some findings that the public doesn't agree with might be a good thing and more democratic, but it's prone to these pitfalls, particularly around money.
Finally, one of the questions that always comes up around election time, particularly by progressives or from progressives who are disillusioned, and rightly so, with our electoral system, is what are the alternatives? Why are we constantly capitulating and voting for the lesser of two evils? I mean, that becomes more problematic at the higher office level and less so at the local office level, but still we've seen it seems as though the sort of decline of the third party from progressives. We've seen a rise in libertarian third parties that are actually making a difference, and in some state level races, in some congressional races. But what has happened to progressive third parties?
That's a good question. I think that the structure of our political system, the sort of first past the post system, really cuts against third parties. Certainly here in California, the fact that we have a jungle primary where only the top two advance to the general election, that certainly cuts against third parties, and they're not even on the ballot in November. So there are structural issues around the way that our democracy is set up, whereas if it was sort of proportional representation and a multi-party democracy like we see in many parliaments across the world, there would be a better chance for lesser parties to have a voice. I think that's important, but we do have to be mindful of the fact that the forces that want to get something out of government rely on the apathy of people who want to get other things. So if even though you may not be interested in politics, politics is certainly interested in you. So that's something we have to be mindful of.
Well, that's a good note to end on. I want to thank you very much, David, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
My guest has been David Dayan. He's a contributing writer at Salon, and we will link from our website to his work at uprisingwithsonali.com. This is Uprising. We turn next to Mumia Abu Jamal, a political prisoner and award-winning journalist who filed this commentary about Election Day.
Who wins? Who loses? Elections are underway, and thanks to the U.S. Supreme Court's Citizens United case, billions of dollars are flooding previously small and uninteresting elections in states, governorships, and Congress. Pundits are in heaven, predicting which way the polls will go, but in truth, no one knows for sure. Perhaps the Republicans will win, perhaps the Dems. The question is, will you? The answer is, at best, doubtful. For both parties are corporate-owned, and they serve those who can afford their services, and that ain't regular folks. In a classic study of political timidity, most Democrats are in full flight in running from President Barack Obama, giving his polling in the low 40s. What makes you think they won't betray you if, after 2 presidential elections, he brought them to the party? But guess who they won't betray? Big corporate funders, big business. Speaking of big business, here is one big winner in the election: the corporate media. For them, it's Christmas time, New Year's, and Rosh Hashanah rolled into one. But for you, for average people, have you really won? From Imprisoned Nation, this is Mumia Abu Jamal. These commentaries are recorded by Noel Hanrahan of Prison Radio.
Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Today's elections are not just about Republicans versus Democrats in the Senate and the House. They're also about who's showing up or not showing up to vote, who's being turned away or not, whose future depends on the outcomes. How will communities of color, women, and young people vote if they show up at all? What impact could the likely outcomes have on those communities? Joining us to help answer those questions and more, including what role President Obama might be playing in the elections, is my guest, Jody Armour. He's the Roy P. Crocker Professor of Law at the University of Southern California and the author of many books, including Negrophobia and Reasonable Racism. Welcome to Uprising, Jody.
Good to be back with you, Sonali.
Thanks so much for joining us. Now, it might be too reductive to examine demographic constituencies because we see the media often just bandying up things like the Latino vote, the Black vote. But I think it is important for us to talk about how certain communities might or might not vote. Let's start with the Latino vote. Given the terrible job that both major parties have done on the issue of immigration. How do you think Latinos will be voting this election? Some have the sense that because President Obama reneged on his promise to take executive action on immigration until after the elections, that they might even sit this one out.
Yeah, it's not going to help that they haven't made good on those promises for sure. To go back to your intro, though, Sonali, I like that point. You know, we think about America as a melting pot a lot of times, and we ignore group differences, but this is one time a year. Every 2 years, we really take social identity seriously, and we start looking at group natures of things, because we know members of groups can feel the pain of other members more sometimes than outsiders can. So when it comes to the so-called Latino vote, for example, I don't think it's necessarily too reductive if we look at Pew Research polls data, and it suggests that there are patterns and that certain members of that group feel a certain kind of pain that maybe those outside don't. For example, I was surprised in thinking about this this morning that 1 out of 4, to find that 1 out of 4 Latinos know someone personally who's been deported in the last year or detained by the government. 1 out of 4. So, you know, they're feeling this immigration issue in the way that a lot of Americans who aren't coming from the immigrant experience aren't. And so that's why this immigration issue, both on the level of deportation and past the citizenship for Latinos, are very important, although many of them will say it's not a deal breaker. 54% say if you are good in other things like education, jobs in the economy, and health care, I may give you a pass on some of the immigration stuff, but that's only 54%. There are a little over 1/3 say it's a deal breaker. And so it is a significant issue, and the fact that the government, that the Democrats haven't made good on their promise to really do something significant about deportation, at least, because this administration has been, you know, really deporting a lot of immigrants, as well as past the citizenship, they should perhaps feel disenchanted, a little disillusioned, and demonstrate their disillusionment by not showing up at the polls.
Jody, why do you think the Democrats continue to let us down? I mean, this should have been a straightforward thing. President Obama did not have the excuse of the House stymieing him in order to take executive action. Why do you think they chose this electoral strategy? And when I say they, of course, I mean the White House, along with some in the Democratic Party leadership.
Oh, yes, political strategizing.
But poor political strategizing.
Yeah, well, he would say, and I don't agree necessarily, but I'll just put this argument out there that I'm waiting until after today to wield my executive power, and then tomorrow or the next day, I'm actually going to get down to it, but I don't want to arouse the ire of the electorate who aren't, sympathetic to this issue and have them vote against our candidate. He would say something like that. But like you said, you have to make political calculations about whose interests you can kind of compromise and whose you can't. And if Latinos feel like you're compromising their interests too much, they may just not show up at the polls. Mr. President, you got 67% of their vote in 2008. Then you got 71% of the Latino vote in 2012. So they've been very faithful to the Democratic Party and to you. You have to show some love back, or maybe they won't show up.
Well, another community that has, of course, been quite faithful to the Democratic Party are African Americans. Where do you think the black vote is in this election? I feel as though we hear this constantly in the media that midterm elections are the ones where voter turnout among African Americans is the lowest. For those who do show up, though, are they going to remain faithful to the Democratic Party?
Yeah, well, the African American vote has been probably the most faithful bloc. Sometimes over 90%. We were talking about Latino votes, 67, 71%. Single women are solid constituency for the Democrats, up around 70%, but the African American over 90%. And so this has been a very faithful constituency, even though the Democratic Party hasn't shown much love back oftentimes. In the Clinton years, they shredded welfare as we knew it, increased the mass incarceration problem. And even under Obama, you could say that there hasn't been a lot of easing in the mass incarceration problems and other things. But you can point to one crowning achievement of Barack Obama's presidency, despite all the other criticism, health care reform. Now, yeah, we should have something like Medicare, all the way down, single payer, all the way down. Yeah, but at least we have millions of people whose suffering can be ameliorated now and couldn't before he stepped in. Bill Clinton couldn't get this through. He went down in flames trying to get national health care through. Even FDR didn't have national health care. So that is a real accomplishment. It's deserving of some recognition, but you can't keep on failing, and you can't have a dossier of failures in all these other areas, Mr. President, continuously, and expect the African American community to remain faithful.
And via Eric Holder, we also saw for the first time some sort of modicum of leadership, even if it was lip service, and the beginnings of some change on the issues of mass incarceration, the easing of sentencing laws that disproportionately affect African Americans. You cited the fact earlier about Latinos knowing at least 1 in 4 knowing at least one person who's been deported. I'm sure there's a similar statistic on African Americans knowing at least one person who's been incarcerated.
That's a great point. One person who's been incarcerated, when you have 1 out of 3 who's been spent time caught up in the criminal justice system in some neighborhoods, 90% wind up in jail on probation, on parole at some point in their lives. Many African Americans, if they don't know someone who's been incarcerated, they know someone who's been profiled. So they have a real sense
and themselves, of course.
Yes, and the connection between the criminal law enforcement system and profiling and the criminal justice system. So that is a burning issue, but this president has been a failure with respect to that issue. Holder didn't come around until the second term.
Right.
In the meantime, he was out here in California fighting efforts to legalize marijuana,
right.
And you know how much that is one of the primary ways that African Americans get caught up in the criminal justice system is empty your pockets. Oh, there's a joint, now you're punched into the system. So I'm going to give him all kinds of credit for that health care reform. Obamacare, you get all kinds of credit. But you've been a miserable failure on some of the key issues to black folks having to do with mass incarceration, et cetera. And yet we are going to keep supporting him,
right.
Because the alternative, it's the lesser of available evils. The alternative is so much worse.
Right.
As bad as you might be, at least you aren't as bad as Bill Clinton coming in and, NAFTA and attacking unions and increasing mass incarceration and all the rest. At least you haven't done that, Mr. President, but you just haven't followed through in the way you should have on some of these other important issues.
Now, aside from Democrats essentially taking black voters for granted, Republicans have just simply waged an all-out assault on the voting rights of African Americans. I mean, the way in which we've seen states like Texas so openly disenfranchise disproportionately voters of color in just a violation of the spirit of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. How do they, in this day and age, get away with it? How do they face people just so openly saying, there's going to be a poll tax, essentially. You don't get to vote. We're turning back the clock.
Yeah, well, this is part of the importance of the midterm elections. We need to recognize this. When you say, why should African Americans get out, Latino, everyone who's has a progressive mindset should get out and vote on a day like this, is because it was in the 2010 midterm elections that they were able to take so many state seats, so many state houses and senates, as well as gubernatorial races were won by Republicans. Then they went in and started putting in these voter ID laws, and they started this voter suppression effort. And so here's another midterm election. If we want to keep that from happening again, we got to get in there. Now, the voter suppression efforts that you're talking about, they are out there. And what they do is they say with a straight face, voter ID is just about getting it fraud, not about suppressing the vote. And we look at them as though they're saying it with a straight face and don't call them out on it as much as we should, because we know that isn't the reason. But they're able to maintain that pretext nonetheless, and we all go for it.
Now, we have not heard or seen very much about perhaps the most explosive domestic story that broke this summer, and that was the anti-police brutality protests in Ferguson, Missouri. Neither the Democrats nor the Republicans seem to have really made this an issue, even though this is one that roiled the country. What does that mean?
Yeah, it seems to be that, black pain and suffering when it comes to their encounters with law enforcement, et cetera, just don't rise to the level of priorities that we should, as a political community, take that seriously and debate in our debates, national, local, and otherwise. And it may go to some constituencies. I think this may in part be an age thing. I've been heartened by the fact that the millennials that I teach, the 17 to 27-year-olds, took Trayvon Martin's case very seriously. They take racial justice and equality more seriously, I think, than some older generations. They get out there and they were protesting and they were stomping, not just on campus but outside of campus. And I don't think that their taste for racial equality and social justice has made its way into the political platforms of the two parties. So maybe they need to press that on the parties, that you need to start talking about this more, debating this more, and doing something more about this.
Now, at the local level in Ferguson, there has been a record high rate of voter registration. 3,000 new voters, primarily black voters, have been registered in this race, in some of the local races ignited by the events of this summer. So at the very least, we are likely to see some kind of change at the hyper-local level in Ferguson in terms of who they elect for those local races. So that could have a high impact. Here in Southern California, where this program is recorded, there's a sheriff's runoff race whose outcome could have a very real impact on communities of color. And I'm wondering if the high voter registration in Ferguson that could affect their local elections pretty severely is a real lesson for local turnout for local races. Probably we might have a sheriff elected with a very small percentage of the vote in this area, and that being mirrored in areas around the country.
Oh yeah, there's no doubt that few things are going to affect the everyday life of many in the African American community more than the attitudes of the police officers that they daily come into contact with, the sheriffs in particular, and that their children, their fathers, their sons, their daughters, come into contact with every day. And whoever's at the helm, in this case it looked like McDonald, the former police chief of Long Beach, is going to wind up winning the position, can make a big difference in how that community interacts with the police department. LAPD, because of the consent decree that it was under for almost 10 years, has seen a turnaround. They've stopped thinking about the community as just an other that needs to be approached in a paramilitary way. And so, yes, if you can get your voice in here as African American voters, you can have a big impact on how the police treat you. And we need to see that's the stakes of these kind of elections and get energized about going out and participating in them for that reason.
Race can often become a very explosive issue during elections. Often it's the Republicans who are bringing it up. And one most recent example is in Louisiana. We have Senator Mary Landrieu, who came under fire from Republicans for suggesting that there might not have been as much support for President Obama in the state of Louisiana because of white racism, essentially. And she also said the state wasn't very friendly to women either. The Republicans are jumping all over this. But frankly, she's right, not just in Louisiana, but nationwide.
Nationwide, and especially in the old Confederacy. There have been some studies that the political attitudes there are a little more anti-black in a variety of ways than in other parts of the country outside the Confederacy. And these researchers trace it back even to the legacy of slavery, et cetera. So that wasn't that much of a reach for her to say it, but it certainly raised the ire of a lot of folks. And certainly there's still a lot of dog whistle politics going on about race, but we don't have it quite like we did, say, in 1988 when you have the Willie Horton ad with him walking around, it turns out this big, dark black recidivist and representing crime and the problem of crime and why you should vote for George Bush Sr. over Dukakis, because Dukakis unleashed these black recidivists on society. We don't have that this election cycle, at least. The others seem to be Ebola, ISIL, ISIS. We've found others right now to focus on, but that racial dimension hasn't been as prominent.
Let's talk about women. Women are being courted by both Democrats and Republicans. And Republicans are not holding back from their anti-choice laws. Where do you think women stand on the midterm elections this year? And are Democrats doing enough beyond simply accusing Republicans of waging a war on women?
Yeah, well, it doesn't seem to be as successful this time around. You know, Mark Udall out in Colorado has been called, Mark Uterus as a way of caricaturing the fact that he seems to be a one-issue candidate, and we're just going to win on this one issue, as if women don't have other concerns than just reproductive health, condoms and pills. Just like the Latino vote, black vote, many others, women care a lot about education, jobs in the economy, health care, right, which this is related to, but a variety of others. So maybe the party shouldn't essentialize or reduce them to, kind of one issue voters. It's hurting them apparently this time around.
Right. Let's talk about young folks. You, as you mentioned earlier, come into contact with a lot of millennials in your classes as you teach at USC. Of course, there's going to be a difference in terms of race, gender, and class on young folks. But do you have a sense that young voters tend to not show up as much for midterm elections, and that being to the detriment of issues important to them?
Oh, yeah. The studies show, there are polls to show and studies to show that there is more, there's a big drop-off in younger voters in midterms, which means that we're allowing older, whiter, more conservative voters to determine things in midterms to the extent that the younger voters stay away. And so if they want their issues to really have an impact, issues like perhaps digital privacy, issues like social justice, which they seem to be more tuned into than others. They recognize the importance of education firsthand because their life is, very much being determined by their educational opportunities right now. Jobs and healthcare all matter to them. Yes, they're going to have to get out and make sure that not only the older voters who don't have their interests at heart necessarily or feel their pain are making all the calls.
Right. Why do progressives also tend to not emphasize electoral politics very much? A lot of activist groups who are on the forefront of pushing progressive change don't often get involved. Many of them are hampered by their nonprofit status. But of course, the makeup of Congress deeply impacts things important to all of us, healthcare, Social Security. And I'm wondering what you think and you hear often this sort of either or, change happens in the streets, not at the ballot. But really, change happens in both places.
Both places. You have to frame the issue. You had George Lakoff on yesterday in which he talked about how important it is to frame the issue throughout the year. Republicans have been good at framing the issue and staying within their frame between elections, and framing the debate in such a way that election day is just evidence of the efficacy of your framing of the issue. So we need to see that as something that we go through each and every day, how important it is to kind of frame these issues in ways that help us prevail at times like this. But I understand the cynicism. Look, I was there when Bill Clinton came in and destroyed labor with NAFTA, came in and $8.8 billion for new prisons, mass incarceration, shredded welfare, that FDR program. And we were saying, this is our Democratic alternative to the Republicans. What is the point of electoral politics, you can wonder, after that kind of cynicism and you see that kind of thing going down? Well, the point is that you have to keep some hope alive here. I think we are at a historical inflection turning point. Look at the electorate here in California. Proposition 47, they may reduce the penalty for a lot of crimes from felonies to misdemeanors, and that's being led by the people. They led on 3 strikes. The politicians were too craven. The people led on medical marijuana being legalized. And so the people, there's a change in the temper, because we came up with the harshest 3 strikes law in California 20 years ago. We were the leaders, and now we're pulling back. We're looking at reconciliation and other ways and restorative justice. So there is hope. We can't give up hope on this electoral process.
Now, I'm wondering whether you think that our culture of voting and the culture of elections really could use some improvement. I mean, we look at some Latin American countries and we see such high voter turnout rates and such energized voters who have tended to pick left-leaning leaders. Problematic as some of those leaders might be, but still, we see a much more engaged and energized civic participation. Even looking at, for example, the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico, where there's a huge percentage of voters that actually turn out. How do we change American culture to actually have people feel more engaged, feel that these are important things to come out for and take the trouble to do research for and go to the polls and make that happen?
Yeah, they have to see that politicians aren't going to cynically break their promise every time they get into office, one thing. And number two, the electorate, we as the electorate, have to really see the stakes of these races. You know, we're talking about making power accountable to those affected by its exercise. This is, we in this democracy, we have a lot of power, but we only can exercise it collectively with others through a political communication process that brings us together, unifies us, and helps us rally for, common goals. And so we have to see that blood and treasure is at stake. They were spending $12 billion a month in Iraq during the war, 2000. Think of $12 billion a month was going into some of these issues we've been talking about, education, jobs in the economy, healthcare, where we could be. Those are the stakes. And we have to recognize those stakes and get motivated through that recognition that blood and treasure are on the line.
And yet, a big part of it is, of course, people simply trying to keep their heads above water, right? So let's sympathize with the overwhelmed voter who is taking care of kids, who may be getting paid hourly. Yes, people who are salaried, technically, depending on which state you live in, I believe, will get some time off to go and vote. But many people who are paid hourly just don't have that option. People who are in the sort of shadow economy, they might be getting paid cash. Tipped workers, for them going out to vote, taking the time to research who to vote for and then actually going out to vote, it makes the difference between being able to put food on the table or not that month. And in Puerto Rico, they get the day off to vote. In many other parts of the world, you get to vote on the weekend or you get a day off, and we don't have a national holiday to vote. So all of these things do put up a lot of roadblocks.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. A day to vote would be just common sense. Why don't we have that? That makes all the sense in the world. And you're right. We have to, I think, approach it though the way we do, maybe going to church on Sunday, or some of it, or as an important devotional. It's hard to make the time in our busy lives and schedules, but this is what we're doing for our kids and for our future.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Jody, for joining us. Your last push, because, of course, we're a nonprofit radio station. We can't tell people who to go out and vote for, but we can tell them to go out and vote.
Heck yes.
By the time this program airs on Free Speech TV, there might just be a few hours left, or maybe 1 hour left on the East Coast for people to go out and vote. But I'm giving you the mic for 30 seconds. What is your best attempt to tell people to go out and vote?
Yeah, everything hangs in the balance. We're talking about mass incarceration, we're talking about foreign adventurism, and we're talking about what the future is going to look like and whether we're going to have social justice as part of that future. It is easy to fall into cynicism with all the broken promises, but I think we're at an important turning point right now.
Jody, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, and that does it for our program. Jody Armour is the Roy P. Crocker Professor of Law at the University of Southern California. He's the author of many books, including Negrophobia and Reasonable Racism. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shulm is our producer and program director. Christian Beck is our intern. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Teddy Robinson and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. Our theme music is by Quetzal. You can find us online at uprisingwithsonali.com. We're also on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube under the handle Uprising Radio. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you tomorrow.